Hello and welcome to Since Attlee and Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party and Lee's husband. In each episode, we will be chewing over delightful morsels of British political history.
In this episode, we're rounding off our latest miniseries, looking at the Heath versus Wilson elections. That's the 4 electoral contests that took place between Harold Wilson, the Labour leader and Prime Minister, and Edward Heath, his Conservative rival, between 1966 and October 1974. In this episode, we're looking at the second contest in 1974, the election that came just about 6 months or so after the February contest. In that February election, Ted Heath loses, and this really comes as a great shock to Ted Heath and many of the people around him. He tries to cling on to power a little bit by offering a deal with the Liberal Party and its leader Jeremy Thorpe, but after a few days, Harold Wilson enters number 10 Downing Street. Ted Heath is effectively left couch surfing for several months as he'd given up the lease on his flat in London and basically had nowhere to live. And Labour was back in government. So, Richard, what was it like for Harold Wilson and the Labour Party returning to office in February 1974?
Well, so we have to remember the context of this election was a crisis election, and the country was experiencing an energy shortage due to the miners' strike, which had begun at the start of February. So this is a country that is still under the emergency measures that Edward Heath had put in place from November of 1973. The country is still experiencing a 3-day week. The election is fought while workers are still on a 3-day week. So when finally, after that long weekend where Edward Heath is trying to work out whether he can stay in government comes to an end and the Labour ministers go to the palace, they enter a Buckingham Palace that is redolent of the crisis that the country is facing. Barbara Castle remarked that the palace was cold, unheated. The Queen did not cater. She wrote, "How very different from last time. No tea, no cucumber sandwiches. Obviously, the palace is economizing too." She thought that Tony Benn and Michael Foot, who now entered government for the very first time as a minister, both looked far too scruffy for the Queen. Wedgie and Mike looked as though they might have been camping, she thought, although she was rather amused to find Michael Foot down on one knee before the Queen. Harold and Mary Wilson made the unusual, but not unprecedented decision not to live in Downing Street. This was mainly driven by Mary Wilson, Harold's wife, who felt that it was too close for comfort for her to be effectively living above the shop, and she felt something like a goldfish in number 10. She also remembered the sense of brutality of having to leave Downing Street in such a quick fashion as the family had had to do in 1970, and she found that all rather upsetting. So from February 1974 until he left Downing Street in the spring of 1976, Harold and Mary Wilson lived in a house down the road in Lord North Street, quite close actually, much closer to the Labour Party's headquarters at that time in Transport House in Smith Square. No one moved into the Prime Minister's flat above number 10, although it was said that it would be used on a temporary basis by members of staff who needed to work late and return early. So, for example, Bernard Donoghu in the October 1974 election would often spend nights in that flat. And sometimes it was said that the Prime Minister, if he really needed to stay late, could spend the night in the flat. But we learned a couple of years ago from Joe Haynes, who was Harold Wilson's press secretary. He's now passed away, and he was very old when he came out with this story. But according to Joe Haynes, Harold Wilson, in that 74 to 76 period, used the flat above Downing Street to conduct an affair with one of his secretaries, Janet Hewlett-Davies. Haynes had caught Janet Hewlett-Davies coming down from the Downing Street flat on one occasion, and she confessed to him what she was doing with the Prime Minister, and he kept it a secret for 50 years until he went to the newspapers about it in 2024. When that story broke, I did a little bit of digging to find out a little bit more about Janet Hewlett-Davies' time in Downing Street. And by chance, I found a sort of human interest story about her that was written in 1975 when she worked in Downing Street. And it's quite interesting if indeed the allegations of the affair are true, because she comments in this 1975 profile about the Prime Minister's empty flat above Downing Street. So I'll just read something from that article. Janet loves her job. It is a position of responsibility close to the political heart of the country. She sees the Prime Minister several times a day, and after 6 years working at number 10, never tires of the atmosphere. It is so pleasant to work in a house and a home rather than an office, and makes for completely different working relationships with people. She says the Wilsons are much happier now that they are living away from Downing Street. It was too easy to bring the job home with you, Janet says. When Mr. Wilson was actually living at number 10, it was too easy for a minister to slip upstairs and say, quote, "Prime Minister, would you mind doing this?" The Wilsons' flat is now used as a temporary overnight accommodation for staff, and Mrs. Wilson uses the office occasionally for her correspondences. And now with the Joe Haynes story, I think that little excerpt reads somewhat differently than perhaps it was interpreted in 1975.
I'm sure plenty of prime ministerial spouses will have had sympathy with Mary Wilson at this time. I mean, it must be in some ways quite grim. Your house is never really your home because there's always people coming in day and night with papers for the Prime Minister or some such. And your life really can become dominated, I think, if you're a prime ministerial spouse, by the need to play host for events. See, if you're like Mary Wilson and not an especially political person, you're not really that interested in. So I can see on the one hand why she felt the idea of living in Lord North Street still, which is one of the best addresses in Westminster for sure, although apparently their house itself was not especially large. I can see why that appealed to Mary Wilson. But then at the same time, had she known, and if what Joe Haynes says subsequently is true about Wilson conducting this affair in number 10, then it is rather a cruel twist of fate that Mary Wilson's decision not to live in number 10 may have enabled this adultery by her husband. And certainly if that is true, it's not a story from which Wilson comes out well at all. I wanted us to focus in a little bit on the circumstances in which the government found the country. Of course, the February election, like you say, is a crisis election. It comes about because Ted Heath basically can't see anything else to do in the context of an energy crisis and a strike from the National Union of Mine Workers. One of the features of that crisis is that Ted Heath consistently thinks he's got a deal with the NUM leaders, but then the union itself won't actually sign on to that deal, and the situation simply keeps on escalating. Now, the Labour Party has, as the political wing of the trade union movement, surely got an advantage in trying to resolve that dilemma. So what does the government set about doing to try and end the state of emergency and get the mine workers to stop their strike and get back to work?
Yes, ending the miners' strike was the number one and immediate task of the incoming Labour government. And in many respects, the Labour Party stood in that election promising, as a result of its ties to the unions, that it would be much better suited to resolving that crisis than Edward Heath. It's interesting that weekend where Edward Heath has lost the election, but he's still trying to see if he can form some kind of arrangement with the Liberals. Harold Wilson largely pulls back from the heat of politics. But one of the important meetings he has at that time is with the leader of the Transport and General Workers Union, Jack Jones. And Jones comes to him and makes a request for a cabinet appointment. So in the Labour shadow cabinet, the shadow employment secretary, who would be, as employment secretary, responsible for these negotiations with the union, was a man called Reg Prentice. And Prentice was very much on the right of the party. Indeed, he eventually defects and becomes a Conservative MP. And the unions just don't think he's going to be the suitable person to come to an arrangement on this. Instead, the person that they want is Michael Foot. And so they say to Wilson, when Labour comes in, move Reg Prentice off of the employment brief, give him something else, and put Michael Foot in as employment secretary. And Wilson listens to that advice. He makes Reg Prentice education secretary, and Foot comes in as employment. Wilson and the Chancellor, and the new Chancellor is Dennis Healey, who remains Chancellor for the entirety of that period that Labour's in government until Thatcher comes in 79, basically give Foot free rein here to negotiate with the unions. The pay board, which had been the quango that had been set up by Edward Heath to recommend what to pay the miners, had during the election recommended that the government give the miners an increase that would cost the Exchequer an additional £98 million. The National Union Mine Workers had wanted an increase that would work out to £138 million of further expenditure. And Foot got them to agree to a £103 million pay increase, which was, of course, much closer to the pay board's recommendation than it was to the union's recommendation. And I think the fact that they could trust Foot to deliver for them, as Foot was promising that he would deliver pro-trade union legislation in the government to come, helped to bring that resolution in a way that probably was more favourable to the government's position than if there had been almost any other minister in charge.
I think that's right in the end, in that the synchronization of those moves and the ultimate settlement that brings a strike to an end does have that effect. In some ways, though, it also shows the double-edged sword that is the Labour Party's relationship to the trade unions. And it was, earlier in the year, part of the Conservative message that, in fact, Labour can't stand up to the unions. They're too close to them and they're financially dependent upon them. And in those early days of this new Wilson government, the idea that actually Wilson is making cabinet appointments based on what trade union general secretaries are telling him seems to actually feed into that Conservative criticism. But I think it is the case on this occasion, like you say, that it helps to actually develop the credibility required to come to an arrangement that is actually more agreeable to the government's position than would have been accepted under Ted Heath. One of the things I think many Conservatives did feel around this time is that Ted Heath had actually offered the trade unions quite a lot. And I think some Conservatives felt that actually what was going on here was that you had people within the union who simply wanted to bring down the government. That for them, what was intolerable wasn't the working conditions of the miners, it was having this Conservative government in number 10. And arguably at the general election, they get what they want because they end Heath's administration and he would never return to power. Some people would think that's a rather conspiracy theory-laden approach to understanding the trade union mindset. But I do think there was definitely a little bit of that going on. So that is arguably the precursor to the Foot appointment and the closer relationship and the deal. The fact that a big part of what some people in the unions wanted was simply to see the back of Ted Heath and his government.
I think that is a little conspiratorial because what the unions are getting is not just a pay settlement, but a pro-union wider government agenda. And this is a really remarkable, if very short-lived, government. This is a government that, in terms of parliamentary sitting time, the government is formed in early March, and from March until the end of July, before it then goes on its summer recess, and that's the end of the government. And in that period, between March and July, the government passes 38 bills, and 2 of these are major trade union bills, basically. So one of them is the Health and Safety at Work Act, which, when Michael Foot introduced it, he put it in the same sort of lineage as the Factory Acts of the 19th century. He said the first Factory Act was passed largely because of the exertions of Robert Owen, who was described, rightly, by Engels as the founder of English socialism. And this measure is the most important of its kind that has been introduced in this House ever, because it contains 3 necessary protections which we socialists think are essential to deal with such problems, the problems of health and safety at work. First, it mobilizes the power of the state to come to the aid of the individual. Second, it guarantees the active participation of working people in the operation of the institutions that are to run their lives. And third, we pin clear responsibility on ministers responsible to this elected House of Commons. They are the 3 pillars which we say are essential to the ideas of democratic socialism, and it is in this spirit that I propose the second reading of this bill. So that was the first of those major bills. The second was the Trade Union and Labour Relations Act 1974. And this bill was, in effect, a repeal of the much hated Industrial Relations Act 1971, which had been passed by the Heath government. Foot had actually wanted to call it the Workers' Rights Act, and the unions stepped in and said, no, that's too contentious. And they were being perhaps more strategically wise than Foot, because their view was, if you call something the Workers' Rights Act, it makes it easier to mobilize opposition to it. If you call it something technical, like the Trade Union Labour Relations Act, sometimes it was called TULRA, this sounds like a kind of technical regulation. And so it's more difficult for the Tories to kind of whip up a campaign against it. But what did this act do? Well, it repealed that Industrial Relations Act. And so in so doing, it abolished the pay board. It ended this industrial court that had been brought up to prosecute strikers with criminal penalties for going on illegal strikes. It protected trade unionists from being sued for taking strike action. It removed the statutory requirement that you needed to have a ballot before going on a strike, which wasn't reintroduced until the Thatcher government in 1984. There were certain things that Foot wanted to do that he couldn't do because it was a minority Labour government and he was relying on the votes of Liberals and nationalist MPs in particular. So Foot wanted to bring back the closed shop, i.e. the requirement that you have to be a member of a union in order to work in a particular workplace. That was something that the Baldwin government had banned after the general strike in 1927. The Attlee government had reintroduced the closed shop. And then it was the Heath government in 71 that then banned the closed shop, and Foot missed his opportunity there. But it's actually quite remarkable to think that without a majority in this very, very narrow time frame, Foot is able as employment secretary to bring in 2 of the kind of most important 20th century trade union bills in that period. And so it's for those reasons, I think, that the unions felt more able to work with the government. This is all called the social contract. The idea that the unions would be given more freedom, in a sense, to negotiate and bargain outside of the strict confines that the Heath government had tried to place them in. In response to that, the unions would exercise greater discretion and restraint in their demands on employers, recognizing the dangers of excessive wage inflation. And in return, the Labour government would provide pro-worker and pro-working class legislation, not just those bills that I mentioned, but also bills related to child benefit, something that Barbara Castle pioneered as Social Services Secretary. She dramatically increased the child benefit program that had initially been introduced by Clement Attlee, higher pensions, food subsidies, caps on the increases in rents in the social housing sector, where this is a time when half of the country lived in social housing. So this was all, none of it was all written down in a specific document called the social contract, but this all collectively became known as the social contract. And it really is one of the great successes from that March to October Labour government.
It's certainly a frenetic pace of legislation that the Labour government is putting out at this time, which is all the more remarkable when you do remember that it's a minority government. Responding to that was actually very difficult for Heath and the Conservatives, and they found themselves in a really challenging position. The best way, I think, to explain that almost is to consider the Tories as both powerful and powerless all at the same time. So the power that they have in this period is that the government is a minority government. if the Conservatives can work with either the Ulster Unionist Party or the Liberals or the SNP, then they can bring the government down on a confidence vote, or they can defeat the government on key legislation. The powerlessness comes from the fact that the Conservatives are terrified that they will defeat the government on a confidence vote and Harold Wilson will get a dissolution, or that there would be a vote on a piece of legislation that Harold Wilson and the government announces as a confidence vote and therefore triggers a dissolution of Parliament and another general election. And the key reason for that is that the Conservatives feel that if there is another general election, they will lose it. They've lost in the February. There's been this unexpected shift back towards Labour. Heath's belief, and I think it's one he was justified in, was, and I'll use his own words that he wrote later to describe it, every election since the war, which has been held on the back of another, has reaffirmed the earlier tide with greater power, as in 1951 and 1966. So his thinking is that if there's an election, the country is not going to turn back to him and say, mea culpa, Heath, we made a mistake in February, will you come back? He thinks that the country will confirm its choice of Harold Wilson and then actually give him the majority that he needs to try and make a real crack at it. And the polling evidence suggests that he is correct on this. So what the Conservatives are terrified of doing throughout this period is using their parliamentary position. They've only got 4 fewer seats than the Labour Party after all, to bring about an election and therefore to bring about what they perceive to be a decisive win for Harold Wilson. A couple of other things it's just worth saying about Ted Heath in this period. He does use this time to make some changes to his shadow cabinet. The main thing that he does is Anthony Barber, who has been Chancellor of the Exchequer, signals that he wants to leave frontline politics, and so there is a bit of a reshuffle. This sees Willie Whitelaw, who's a very important figure in these years in Conservative politics, become party chairman. We've recently done a bonus episode on him with one of the 2 people who was Whitelaw's official biographer, which is available on Spotify and our Patreon. And what was significant about this is it was a classic Willie Whitelaw move to accept that role. Everybody thinks the Tories are in for a tanking the next time the voters get to have their say, and he is willing to be the one carrying the can as party chairman throughout the year. It's a very Whitelaw move and a very noble thing that he does. There are at this time some challenges to Heath's position as leader. It's not a challenge to his actual status as leader of the party. The incredibly close outcome from the February makes pretty much everybody think that there's no chance to remove Heath. They know that there will be an election at some stage. They think a new leader would not have the chance to get their feet under the table in time for going to the country. You know, think back to the discussions around 1966 when Heath is only in for a short period of time and gets a pasting at the polls. They think that if they replace Heath now, the same would happen to whoever succeeds him. But there is dissatisfaction with him. And that dissatisfaction starts to take on a slightly more ideological rather than personal bent. So Ted Heath is in many ways best remembered for his personal failings, his lack of charm, his lack of gregariousness, his inability to flatter people or even appear like he's got emotional intelligence. But actually, the disagreements that are taking shape in this time are about the policy direction that he followed in government and that he is remaining wedded to now that he's back in opposition, including around things like prices and incomes policy. And the alternative vision to Heathism, for want of a better word, and I'm sure there are better words, but the alternative agenda to the one that Heath is offering becomes identified with a form of monetarism and a more laissez-faire liberal economic approach. Ideas that were once associated very firmly in the Conservative Party with Enoch Powell, but are now more likely to be championed by Keith Joseph. Not yet really Margaret Thatcher, it's worth saying, not yet at least in the public and most other people's eyes, but certainly Joseph is there. Powell, for his part, and we've spoken about Enoch Powell in all of these episodes on these elections, he is no longer an immediate threat to Edward Heath in the way he has been in the past, because he has not endorsed the Conservatives. In fact, he's encouraged people to vote for Labour in the February election. He's not stood for Parliament himself, and he is out of Parliament at this stage for the first time in almost a quarter of a century. He's pretty despondent, pretty depressed about not being in Parliament anymore, and he is beginning to shift towards what will happen in the October election, which is that he will stand as an Ulster Unionist candidate in Northern Ireland and re-enter the House of Commons that way. So that's a bit of a look at the landscape on the right of politics at this time as the Tories move into opposition. And brings us on, Richard, I think, to talking about one of the issues we've had to neglect for the sake of brevity in the earlier episodes of this mini-series, but which is fundamental to understanding what's going on in this period, and that is Northern Ireland.
Absolutely. Northern Ireland plays a central role, really, in the politics of the rest of the United Kingdom in this period. This is, of course, the height of the Troubles. It's a particularly bloody period in the Troubles. During the Heath government, which was a government of only 3.5 years, 1,000 people die in the Troubles, in the bloodshed between the Nationalists and the Unionists. There are a few important moments in the Heath government that are worth remarking on. The first is 30th of January 1972, Bloody Sunday, a day when 14 unarmed Catholics were killed on a protest, and the Nationalists, who had actually originally seen the British troops in Northern Ireland as a source of protection for them against the loyalist paramilitaries, come to see the British troops as a hostile force. Throughout that period, the security situation worsens. The political dynamics in Northern Ireland is that Northern Ireland has had a devolved government since Northern Ireland was created in 1921. But that devolved government had been perennially dominated by the Protestant majority in Northern Ireland. And the Catholic community is expressing their wish that they should be able to have input in the governments of the province. And Edward Heath tries to bring about some kind of power sharing between the two communities in Northern Ireland. He's initially rebuffed by the Protestant leadership in Northern Ireland. And in March of 1972, he suspends devolution in Northern Ireland, and he makes Willie Whitelaw the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. Willie Whitelaw seems to be the Secretary of State for jobs that no one else wants, and imposes direct rule over Northern Ireland. That is an attempt to try to work out a new solution where you can get to a power sharing arrangement. But in the meantime, the political violence between the two sides heats up further. And we see in March 1973 the extension of the IRA bombing campaigns out of Northern Ireland and into England. So in March 1973, the Old Bailey and the Ministry of Agriculture in Whitehall are bombed. 200 people are injured, one dies. In September 1973, King's Cross and Euston stations in London are also bombed. A dozen people are injured in those bombings. And in December of 1973, finally, the Heath government comes to an arrangement called the Sunningdale Agreement, which is to set up a power-sharing executive in Northern Ireland, where you will have the Unionists represented by the UUP, the Ulster Unionist Party, and the Nationalists represented by the Social Democratic and Labour Party, the SDLP, and the Non-Sectarian Alliance Party come together as a power-sharing arrangement, which is very similar to what was set up in the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland in the late 1990s. But the Sunningdale Agreement doesn't last. And after Labour comes into power in March of 1974, it's clear that the arrangement is deeply unpopular, particularly with the Protestant population in Northern Ireland, who see this as a sellout to Dublin. And so in May of 1974, the Ulster Workers' Council, which was the trade union body dominated by Protestants in Northern Ireland, declares general strike. And this, in effect, is an attempt to shut down Northern Ireland. There's terrible shortages, power supply in particular, and at the same time, loyalist paramilitaries are backing up the strike, are enforcing the strike, and are actually attacking and killing people who break the picket lines and are effectively scabbing on the strike. And the Protestant paramilitaries are also extending their bombing campaign out of Northern Ireland and into the Republic of Ireland. And on the 17th of May, Dublin and an Irish town called Monaghan are bombed. There are 4 car bombs that go off. 7 die, 300 are injured. And then a month exactly after that, on the 17th of June, 1974, the Provisional IRA retaliate with their own bombing campaign in London, where they blow up Parliament, and Westminster Hall is bombed. Westminster Hall is the oldest part of the parliamentary estate. It's been there since just after the Norman conquest. And the photographs are very dramatic. You see the building, and you see the parliamentary estate in flames. Thank God it was put out in time, and Westminster Hall was saved. No one died, although a dozen people were injured. As an interesting side note, this was said to have made some MPs very, very nervous about their own security going into Parliament, and it's alleged to have contributed to the mental breakdown of a Labour MP called John Stonehouse, who later that year would, in very bizarre circumstances, fake his death and flee to Australia. We'll probably do an episode on John Stonehouse at some point. But this is all to say that the period of 1972 to 1974 in Northern Ireland is totally, literally explosive. And it is something that cannot be ignored in Westminster. It brings itself to the heart of Westminster. And the inability of both Labour and Conservative governments to find some kind of peaceful resolution in Northern Ireland is one of the major and longer lasting policy failures of the 1970s. And we really don't see anything approaching a resolution to that conflict for another 2.5 decades, which is pretty extraordinary.
Those of us who live on the mainland part of the United Kingdom do have an unfortunate habit, I think, of tending to overlook politics in Northern Ireland until we have no choice but to pay attention. I certainly think that's part of the problem our political class has at times. Well, this is a period in which you have no choice but to pay attention. Right? There is basically a civil war taking place in a part of the United Kingdom and spilling out onto the streets of London and elsewhere. It's also a time in which the politics of Northern Ireland is having a very direct and highly consequential impact on the outcome of general elections, which is guaranteed to attract the interest of party leaders. So historically, the Ulster Unionist Party in Northern Ireland had an arrangement with the Conservative Party whereby Unionist MPs would take the Conservative whip in the House of Commons. So you could typically add, if you are the Conservative chief whip, best part of a dozen or so additional MPs to your numbers for votes. It's during the time when Ted Heath is Prime Minister that this arrangement collapses. And it collapses because of the issues that Richard described and the controversy of the power sharing arrangement that's being agreed and attempting to be implemented at Sunningdale. Well, that has a big impact in the February election because there are 11 Ulster Unionists elected from Northern Ireland. Now, if you add those 11 to the 297 MPs that the Conservatives win, that is a significant number more than Harold Wilson and the Labour Party have won. And one of the things that Ted Heath looks to do when he's trying to cling on to power, to phrase it unfortunately, is to see whether or not he can do a deal with at least some of those Ulster Unionist MPs. And so the Conservatives approach 7 of them, which doesn't include the most hardline anti-power sharing MPs who have been elected, and to try and do a deal to add them into the Conservative parliamentary numbers. But no deal can be done. And this fragmentation between unionism in Northern Ireland and the Conservative Party in the United Kingdom basically thereafter continues.
And on the Labour side, Labour is meeting with nationalist MPs and nationalist campaigners to see if they will give their support to the Labour government. And they're finding that the nationalists are mostly being fairly recalcitrant, even though their politics is further on the left than most of the unionist MPs. Bernard Donoghu, who was one of Harold Wilson's political advisors, recalls a meeting with people like Jerry Fitt, John Hume, Bernadette Devlin. These were nationalist MPs or people who wanted to become nationalist MPs from Northern Ireland in the SDLP or independent nationalists. And he found that they were claiming that their worry was that the unionists were going to declare UDI, a unilateral declaration of independence, on the same kind of basis that Ian Smith, the white Rhodesian leader, had done, where the Wilson government of the 60s had said no independence without majority Black African rule. And here they were worried that the Protestant unionists would basically create their own independent country called Ulster as a way of preserving Protestant majoritarianism over the minority Catholic population. And Donoghu, who was himself of Irish heritage, did sort of writes about how he felt that their claims were very wild and uncooperative. So this is both Labour and the Conservatives have their own different problems with the MPs coming out of Northern Ireland.
Before we come on to the general election campaign, the short campaign itself, we spoke in the episode about 1917 at Ted Heath's newfound hobby, that he became this great world-acclaimed yachtsman. And several of the yachts that he owned had the name Morning Cloud. I don't think it's a name he actually came up with himself. I think it was already the name of one of the boats that he bought, and he quite liked it, so he kept it, and then it was repeated, and then it became iconically associated with him in the way that sometimes these things do happen by accident. But by this time, it was Morning Cloud 3 that Heath owned. And during the summer of 1974, he had spent some time on it, and then it was handed over to the movement crew, who were the people who would look after the boat in between races. And they were due to go sailing, and Ted Heath's godson asked if he could join them. Heath said yes, so long as the crew were okay with it, and they were. But then tragedy unfolded, and I thought I would read part of what Heath said about it in his memoirs, which are typically not a great read, but I think this bit here is really quite compelling. At about 11 p.m. on Monday the 2nd of September, Morning Cloud was still moving comfortably offshore him, only a few miles from calmer waters, when a freak wave knocked the boat over. There was a certain amount of damage, but the boat righted itself. 2 of the crew had gone overboard. One was retrieved, but the other, Nigel Cumming, could not be found, even when the boat turned around to search for him. With the weather now worsening, the crew continued to search for Nigel. Then it was hit by a second wave, and once again overturned. Christopher Chadd, that's his godson, had been wearing a life jacket, but not a safety harness. He was swept off the deck as he moved towards the cockpit and was lost. The boat was now leaking seriously, and Blewett, the captain, concluded that none of them would survive unless the 5 of them crammed into the 4-man life raft, a 6-man life raft having been swept away. He and another crew member were, by now, badly injured. After 8 hours in the raft, during which all the remaining crew suffered badly from the still very rough water, they were washed ashore near Brighton. The shattered shell of the boat was soon recovered, and the bodies of the 2 lost men were washed ashore some days later. So it's not an event of great political consequence, but it's clearly a personal tragedy for Ted Heath to have lost his godson, to have lost his yacht, to have one of the other people who worked on it to have died at sea. And that happens just before, in the weeks before dissolution, for this next general election. Now, Heath would always deny that that would have any impact on his thinking and claims to have just stoically got on with it during the contest. But I think such a gut-wrenching personal tragedy as that must have really affected his mind and his mood during this period. That brings us up really to the calling of the election. So because of the closeness of the February result, this ends up being the shortest parliament since 1681, although, as you've said, Richard, one of the busiest in terms of legislation per sitting days that there's probably ever been, I would have thought, certainly in the modern era.
And not just legislation, but in terms of budgets, Dennis Healey manages to squeeze in 2 budgets in 5 months.
Crikey. It's, I mean, that is not an example I think any of us want to see Rachel Reeves following, least of all her colleagues in government. But it's always clear, and part of the reason for the pace of action in that parliament is that Wilson will go back to the country and seek a majority and a mandate to govern. And so on the 7th to the 8th of September, whilst the Queen is up in Balmoral in Scotland, Harold Wilson heads up to see her, requests a dissolution of Parliament, and it's granted. There is some doubt on the Conservative side, actually, about whether or not a dissolution necessarily will be granted after so soon after the last general election, or whether or not Buckingham Palace will see it as having a responsibility to try and see whether or not there is some arrangement that can be brought about. I actually think that was, in practice, never going to happen. By far and away, the safest thing for the monarch to do is to grant a dissolution when asked, unless there's a really extraordinary reason not to. This debate around the Lascelles principles, I really don't think they apply in this case, given the fact there's a hung parliament with no majority. So, Richard, how does Wilson, having got his dissolution, go about trying to win the second election of 1974?
Well, as you say, Lee, this election wasn't a surprise. Over the summer recess, cabinet ministers had been asked to submit their proposals for a manifesto for a future general election. After Wilson returns from Balmoral, a week later, there's a joint meeting of the Cabinet and the Labour National Executive Committee. This meeting is held in 10 Downing Street, and this enables Harold Wilson to cater the meeting. Barbara Castle writes in her diaries that the draft manifesto had been kept under wraps with as much security as if it had been the crown jewels. So it's when they all meet at Downing Street to, in effect, agree the manifesto, that this is the first time that the cabinet ministers and the NEC, or at least most of them, are seeing the full manifesto. They will have seen their draft of their particular bit that they submitted, but they won't have seen the full document. Sometimes these meetings can be very contentious, and there were some debates, particularly over whether Labour should agree once again to have a referendum on leaving the European Economic Community, and if so, whether there should be some kind of timeline put in place, whether that's something that should happen within 6 months of a general election or 12 months of a general election or unspecified. Roy Jenkins, the Home Secretary, didn't want it in at all. Ultimately, the referendum pledge is put into the manifesto. But generally speaking, the mood of that meeting is very positive. It's very constructive. Barbara Castle says the atmosphere was one of determined harmony. Even those who were often some of the more, how should we say, difficult characters in the Labour National Executive Committee, like the perennial backbencher Ian Mercado, a left-wing MP who represented East London. Even he was talking in conciliatory language. Barbara Castle partly credited the Number 10 catering for this. She said that there was a lavish buffet with salmon and excellent wine. And everyone was in such a good mood and was so chatty and jocular that sometimes Harold Wilson struggled to keep them on focus about the manifesto itself. So much so that at one point, Harold Wilson declared, "Next time I shall serve lemonade," which just provoked more giggles from the Labour figures. I think one thing that Wilson did, which was very smart, which again I think helped to alleviate any kind of sense of anxiety or jitters that the Labour ministers would have had about the election, is Wilson basically promised there wouldn't be a reshuffle. or a major reshuffle after the election. So he said to the cabinet at the final cabinet meeting before the election, "I don't want any of you sitting next to a telephone after the poll. If we win, I would not expect to make any change in a winning team. Just catch up with your sleep and be at your desk on Monday morning." So I think Wilson, one of his great talents as a party leader is his ability to hold a very otherwise fractious team together. And this was part of his strategy, I think, in doing that. So Labour, I think, gets off to a very good start in the campaign and starts off on the right foot.
One of the things that strikes me about Wilson and his party management, which really is his forte as leader throughout his entire time at the top of the Labour Party, but certainly what strikes me about his party management at this time is that the cabinet is pretty stable. Like you say, when he comes back in the February, he's bringing back a lot of the people who were in his last government. Now, you could say that the criticism that he once made of the Conservative Party, that they were yesterday's men, actually becomes true of him and his government, because they are yesterday's men and a woman.
Which is what David Dimbleby accused them of in his infamous documentary about that shadow cabinet.
Absolutely. To some degree, it becomes true. But the benefit for Wilson, the upside for Wilson, is not only that he has experienced ministers who really rather know what they're doing by this stage, but he also, with only a couple of exceptions, has senior ministers around him who he has effectively built up. Lots of them were not big names in 1964 when Wilson came into government and first started giving them their position on the ministerial ladder. By now, they're some of the biggest names in British politics, and most of them owe that to Wilson. You mentioned about the Labour manifesto being a tightly guarded secret. Not so tightly guarded on the Conservative side, I must say. So the Conservative manifesto, which was simply called Putting Britain First, leaked before it was due to be published. This is something which, I must say, Ted Heath didn't, with hindsight at least, feel particularly bothered about. He thought that the leaking of a manifesto meant that it got rather more media attention than it otherwise might. Particularly important to get media attention in this election campaign, because with it being the second of the year, there's seen, certainly by the press and the media, as almost being a bit of fatigue around politics. So this election attracts rather less attention than the contest in February. It's also, for most of the time, seen as being an election that's got a fairly obvious result, with Harold Wilson winning again. And of course, elections that are seen to be foregone conclusions also don't tend to attract quite the attention that closer contests do. But this leaking of the manifesto gets the Conservative message out there.
And it's thought that that manifesto was probably leaked due to members of the Print Workers Union passing on the manifesto to the Labour Party and to the press. So Harold Wilson certainly had an advanced copy of it even before its details appeared in the newspapers. And Bernard Donahue writes that his suspicion was it was the print workers who had passed it over to Downing Street.
And there you were saying it was conspiratorial to think of the trade unions up to no good against the Conservatives. But there are two things I really wanted to point out about the Conservative approach in this campaign and its manifesto. One of them is to talk up national unity. So Heath said around this time, "I have no doubt that the real hope of the British people in this situation is that national coalition government involving all the parties should be formed, and the party differences could be put aside until the crisis is mastered." This sort of language and this sort of pledge even makes it into the actual manifesto itself, which says that the Conservatives, quote, "will consult and confer with the leaders of other parties and with the leaders of the great interests of the nation in order to secure for the government's policies the consent and support of all men and women of goodwill." I assume Harold Wilson would not be counted as a man of goodwill, what we could see. Anyway, it goes on. "We will invite people from outside the ranks of our party to join with us in overcoming Britain's challenges." Now, the real important thing to note about this is that the Conservatives are going into an election that they expect to lose. And when you think you're going to lose an election, these words are quite cheap. And really what I think is happening here is that the Conservatives are trying to, look, generous, and motivated by the national interest, so that after the election, when they are presumably on the opposition benches still, they can throw this back at the Labour government and say, well, we were willing to work together. We were putting the national interest ahead of the partisan interest. Why don't you do the same? So I think we should see that very much as being politicking, gimmickry, you might even say, on the part of Heath.
I think that's right. I would just say I have an additional theory to this, which is that I think Edward Heath felt burned by his failure to get the Liberals to support the Conservatives and the UUP to support the Conservatives after the February 74 election. And he really had done, I think, very little preparation for some kind of coalition before the election result. And so I wonder if he's doing what sometimes people say is rolling the pitch to bring in particularly the Liberals and Ulster Unionists into a Conservative government. I think, in spite of the fact that the manifesto talks about a national government, I think there was absolutely no sense that there would be a Labour Conservative government, but there might have been a sense that, if we have another hung parliament, let's put ourselves in a stronger position to having a kind of Conservative, Liberal, Unionist government of some sort. In any case, I don't know if it backfires, but it certainly is used by Harold Wilson against Heath during the campaign. So one of his more memorable lines in the campaign, he describes the talk of the national government as a desperate attempt by desperate men to get back into power by any means. Coalition would mean con policies by a con party for a con trick. If they couldn't have strong government, they want weak government, feeble government, botched up government, divided government, fraudulent government, anything, so long as it is government dominated by the Conservative Party and a few sops to the Liberals.
Crikey. The other thing that I wanted to mention about the Conservative offer in this election is that it does focus on a few crowd pleasers in electoral terms. And the face of some of these crowd-pleasing policies is one Margaret Thatcher. Now, she has been moved from the education brief to the environment brief after the February defeat. The term environment is rather misleading from the vantage point of today's politics in terms of understanding what that department used to do. It was literally concerned with the environment in its broadest sense, including the built environment and housing policy, as well as the things that we today think of as being environmental. Two of the policies that she helped announce, one was a limit on interest rates, i.e. for mortgages, of 9.5%, which of course is eye-watering to us today, but was below inflation at the time, which was 11%. And this is also the time when the right to buy policy is beginning to take shape in Tory minds. Heath would write about it rather bitterly in years to come, not least because the policy became so associated with Margaret Thatcher. And he would always say that it would have been much better if he had managed to implement it alongside Peter Walker, who was really the architect of much of this thinking, because under his proposals, some of the money that's generated from selling council houses would have been reinvested back into the housing stock, something, of course, that didn't end up happening as it ought to have done in the 1980s. So this is really what the Tory message is. It's all about national unity on the one side, from a position of electoral weakness and expecting to lose. But there are plenty of attempts to throw some red meat at the voters to try and get them interested in what it is the Tories have to say.
Again, though, it's a promise that I think somewhat backfires on the Conservatives by making a pledge of maintaining interest rates for mortgages at 9.5%, which is below inflation. This seems very unrealistic. Bernard Donoghue, who's looking at the internal Labour polling, as well as the public polling, writes in his diaries that after Thatcher makes this announcement, there's a growing sentiment among voters that Conservatives were making promises that they could not afford to keep. In the election campaign, there are, I think, 3 pre-election surprises. One relates to pandas, one relates to Europhiles, and one relates to the IRA. So on the first one, the panda story, this is a sort of September surprise in the election where the Chinese government send 2 pandas, Chia Chia and Ching Ching, to the London Zoo. And these pandas are very cute, much beloved by the public. Visitor numbers at the London Zoo double in the month between September and October 1974. The pandas were actually very expensive to maintain. The bamboo could only be grown in Cornwall, and there had to be 2 express trains that would take this bamboo shipment from Cornwall to Paddington every week. But what was seen as political about this was that these pandas had been negotiated for by Edward Heath the previous year with Mao Zedong. Heath had sent the Chinese some deer. They were apparently delighted with this deer. I don't really know what was so special about the deer, but they were apparently delighted with them. And in return, as a result of Heath's warming with China, Britain got the pandas. And this was seen potentially as an effort by the Chinese to remind the British public of the good relations with China that Edward Heath had built up during his premiership as a way of tilting the election result. I'm not sure it was quite as conscious as that, but that's how it was partly read. The second surprise, as I mentioned, had to do with Europhiles. This was relating to 2 members of the Labour cabinet, Shirley Williams and Roy Jenkins, who during the election campaign, without authorization from the Prime Minister, said that if Labour took Britain out of Europe, they would resign from the government. And this was very embarrassing for Labour because Labour was promising a referendum that gave the British public the opportunity to instruct the government to leave Europe. And then here you have a couple of Labour ministers who basically say they would refuse to honour the referendum result. And Roy Jenkins said that he didn't believe a referendum was binding on the government. This may all sound very familiar to those of us who have lived through the past decade in British politics. So Wilson had to kind of compensate by that, by taking maybe a little bit of a harder line on the common market than he may have otherwise done, and also to give a boost to some of the more Eurosceptic ministers during that election. Peter Shaw, in particular, one of the very strongly anti-EEC Labour cabinet ministers, gave some pretty punchy speeches during the campaign. And the final surprise in the election happens the weekend before voters go to the polls, where innocent civilians, members of the public, who are drinking at a pub in Guildford are brutally murdered by the Provisional IRA at the Guildford pub bombings. And there's some debate in Downing Street whether Harold Wilson should go to Guildford to express his sorrow and sympathy. It's determined that that might be seen as politicizing the event so close to the general election. And so Roy Jenkins, as the Home Secretary, is sent instead. It's just a reminder that unresolved conflict in Northern Ireland cannot be ignored in England during this campaign as well.
So let us get on to the election result itself. So voters go to the polls on the 10th of October. Now, this is a time, as we've mentioned a couple of times in this mini-series, when election night coverage is becoming more sophisticated and things like exit polls are becoming a feature of general elections. But they are really in their infancy, I think it's worth saying. And the story from Willie Whitelaw's memoirs, she helps show a little bit about how exit polls aren't quite the reliable banker of judging the outcome of an election that they are today. So Willie Whitelaw was the MP for Penrith and the Border up in Cumbria, and he leaves his constituency in the evening to get on the train to Euston to be with party workers in London as the results start to come in. And he is for much of that time cut off from the outside world. And he arrives in Euston to have somebody rush up to him to tell him the results of a BBC exit poll, which is that Labour will have a majority of 135 over all other parties, a landslide win. So gloomy, totally down, depressed, Whitelaw heads to central office. But then as the results start to come in, it's quite clear that the election is much, much closer than that. It is worth saying that ITN also had an exit poll in the election, and there's forecast a Labour majority of 15. So hats off really to ITN for their forecasting ability in this election. In terms of the overall results, Harold Wilson and the Labour Party win 319 seats. That's up 18 on the February election. They do so with just under 11.5 million votes, or 39.2% of the vote, and that's up 2 percentage points on 6 months earlier. For Edward Heath and the Conservatives, they win 277 seats. That's down 20. And they win them with just under 10.5 million votes. So whereas the Conservatives came top in the February election, they're now about 1 million behind the Labour Party, and their vote share drops another 2.1 percentage points to 35.8%. The Liberals, who had done very well in the February election, continue to do very well, but their momentum stalls and falls back ever so slightly. So they win 5.3 million votes, or 18.3% of the overall total. But that only gets them 13 constituencies in the House of Commons. They say unlucky for some. It certainly would be unlucky for Jeremy Thorpe in the years that followed. And then one of the really remarkable features of this election happens in Scotland. It's quite easy from the perspective of today to sometimes think of the great rise of the Scottish National Party, the SNP, and all the talk about independence as being a relatively recent phenomenon, of a post-devolution phenomenon. But this election really shows how that isn't the case. One of the reasons why it's clearly not the case at this time is oil. So by this stage, we now know there's lots of oil in the North Sea. It's not yet being pumped out. But the question begins to emerge, if the United Kingdom is going to benefit a great deal from money generated by extracting oil from the North Sea in what are quote-unquote Scottish waters, why shouldn't Scotland benefit more from it? This becomes a great rallying cry for the SNP and for Scottish nationalists. The phrase, "It's Scotland's oil," is plastered on posters north of the border, and it's clearly quite compelling. Why wouldn't it be? And the SNP earned 30.4% of the vote in Scotland in this election. For context, that's more than the SNP got in 2024 in Scotland, and it earns them 11 seats in the House of Commons. And that is up from what they got in what was already a very good result for them in February. So this is really an election in which the SNP stamp themselves very firmly on the electoral map of Scotland and add somewhat to this increasingly fractured picture of the United Kingdom. We've spoken a little bit about what's happened in Northern Ireland. The SNP are on the rise in Scotland. In the last episode, we mentioned about Plaid Cymru winning their first general election seat in February of 1974. So lots of the tensions which you still see playing out in the United Kingdom and its politics today were very much in evidence in 1974 as well.
And one of the few changes between the February and the October Labour manifestos is that the October Labour manifesto contains a promise on devolution for Scotland, which of course becomes extremely important in the bringing down the Labour government in 1979, when the SNP team up with Margaret Thatcher and the Liberals to vote Labour out of office. Just a couple of further reflections on the results. The first is that Labour MPs were very optimistic about this election result. Barbara Castle said at the start of the campaign, quote, "I have a curiously strong hunch that we are going to win this election, and I am usually a Cassandra." And Wilson had told Castle, "I've never enjoyed a campaign as much." There was a sort of very optimistic sense. And the polling, the pre-election polling, did show that Labour could be on the course for quite a significant majority. Many people in Labour had in mind the 64 to 66 result, where Labour goes from a tiny majority to a landslide, or close to a landslide. And they thought Labour would go from a tiny minority to a fairly substantial working majority. And so when those exit polls showed that Labour was looking at a good, healthy majority, that kind of confirmed what people suspected would be the result of that campaign. But I think what ended up happening, if you look at that result, is that, first of all, the national swing itself wasn't that big. It was 2.2% from Conservatives to Labour. But even that was unrepresentative of how Labour did in the marginal seats against the Conservatives, where the swing from the Conservatives to Labour in the marginals, the seats where it mattered the most, was much smaller than the national swing. And one example of that I'll give is the seat of Hemel Hempstead. In February of 1974, the Conservatives held that seat with 187 votes. In October of 1974, Labour gained that seat with a majority of 485 votes. So that's a swing of just 0.5% from Conservatives to Labour. So that is one of those really important net gains that Labour makes off the Conservatives in that election. But there were other seats that fell just below the threshold that otherwise probably would have gone to Labour had there been a national swing that was represented in the in the marginals. And as an aside, the reason that seat came to my mind is because my grandfather was a Labour activist in that seat, and there's a picture of him on polling night in October 1974 on the stage with the victorious Labour MP Robin Corbett. And my grandfather is stood just behind him on stage. He's wearing a Labour rosette as well. I'm not quite sure why he's on stage. He had been the mayor, but I don't think he was mayor at the time of the election. But he might have been maybe the Labour agent or something like that. But he's clearly very happy with the result.
A very final thought on the election. Yes, it's a Labour win, but it's also incredibly close. And I think many people on the Conservative side, with hindsight, would come to look at how close this election was and the avoidance of that Labour landslide that so many people feared as one of the things that enabled the Conservatives to return to power in 1979 and to begin those 18 years of Conservative government, mostly under Margaret Thatcher from then on. But we'll have to save that for whenever we get around to a Thatcher elections miniseries. We finish each episode as ever with a look at the books that we're reading at the moment. Richard, why don't you kick us off?
Well, the book that I wanted to recommend for this episode, because it's related to the topic of the episode, a book called Britannia Bright's Bewilderment in the Wilderness of Westminster by Clive James. This is an epic poem written about British politics in 1976. And it's very, very amusing for those of you who are interested in the politics of the time. Clive James creates pseudonyms for all of the kind of big figures of the day. And just to give you an example of a few of, if we think of the trade union leaders who were so important in the social contract of the Labour government, you have Len Mumble for Len Murray, Hughie Screwy for Hugh Scanlon, Jack Joke for Jack Jones, Joe Gormless for Joe Gormley, Arthur Numbskull for Arthur Scargill, and Sid Grease for Sid Wheel. So it's out of print now, but it's also got lots of amusing cartoons of the political characters of the day. And if you're looking for a good bit of political satire, if you can find a copy on Abe Books or eBay or in a secondhand bookshop, then it's really worth snatching up. Lee, what's your book this week?
This week, I wanted to recommend a book that I read a couple of years ago before a trip to Northern Ireland, which is Making Sense of the Troubles by David McKittrick and David McVeer. The first thing I want to say is that, of course, Northern Ireland is much, much more than just its recent history and certainly much more than just the Troubles. But of course, they are in many ways an essential part of its recent history in the last 5-6 decades or so. And the divides that led to the Troubles, of course, are still principally the divides in Northern Irish politics. I said in the episode that I think lots of us who live in the Great Britain part of the United Kingdom too often don't make a great effort to understand the politics of Northern Ireland as well as we should. I'm sure I'm guilty of that. It's actually a wider point as well that those of us who often think about Westminster politics far too often neglect what is politics in Scotland and Northern Ireland as well, and quite possibly other parts of England, now that there's devolution there too. But this was a book which I found really readable. It's fairly detailed, but it's quite narrative driven about the events that took place leading up to and during the Troubles. It starts with the story before the outbreak of violence in the late 1960s and takes it up until the DUP and Sinn Féin power sharing, which once upon a time I think would have seemed unimaginable to a great many people. The other thing I found particularly good about this book, actually, and very useful, is if you're not necessarily steeped in this history, sometimes you can read it and think you're understanding it and recalling the names and the events, and then you put the book down and you sometimes struggle to go back to them. There's a tremendously detailed chronology towards the back of the book, which really highlights a lot of the key events that took place and really came to define the period known as the Troubles. We'll have links to the chosen books in our show notes, but that's all from us this week. That brings to an end this latest mini-series on the Heath versus Wilson elections, but we'll be back on Wednesday with our next Matters of Interest, and then on Sunday with our next deep dive into an issue in post-war British political history. We'll see you then.
Thanks very much.